Rain hammered the porch roof the night my husband handed me a garbage bag instead of an umbrella. 20 years of marriage, and Richard stood in the doorway of the house I had scrubbed, painted, and prayed in, looking at me the way you'd look at a stranger who'd overstayed a visit. His mother's ashes weren't even cold in the ground. "I only needed you to take care of my mother," he said. Calm as a man reading a grocery list, I waited for him to laugh. To say it was a bad joke. He didn't. He told me to pack. He told me not to expect anything. I want to tell you how I got there, standing on my own front steps with a suitcase and no coat, because it didn't happen in one night. It happened over 4 years, one small erosion at a time, the way a riverbank disappears without anyone noticing until the house built on it starts to lean. My name is Joanna Cross. I'm 46 years old, and until 4 years ago, I taught 4th grade at Oakwood Elementary. I loved that job with the kind of love that doesn't ask for anything back. The smell of pencil shavings, the sound of 28 kids reciting multiplication tables off-key, the way a shy child's face would open up like a window when they finally understood fractions. I gave it up the year Margaret, my mother-in-law, was diagnosed with Parkinson's with advancing dementia features. Richard said his mother needed someone she trusted, someone patient, someone who wouldn't put her in a facility like she was furniture nobody wanted anymore. He said it would be temporary. He said we'd hire help eventually. Eventually never came. So I left my classroom, my kids, my gradebook still half filled with October's vocabulary scores, and I became a full-time caregiver. I learned how to cut Margaret's food into small pieces so she wouldn't choke. I learned the exact rhythm of her physical therapy exercises, the exact volume of voice that didn't startle her, the exact songs from the 1950s that could pull her back from wherever her mind had wandered to. There were days she looked at me and called me by her sister's name, a woman who'd been dead for 40 years. There were days she didn't know her own son's face when he walked through the door for 5 minutes before leaving again for work, but she always knew mine, always. Even in her worst hours when the disease had taken almost everything else, some part of her recognized me as someone safe. Richard, meanwhile, climbed. He was a regional vice president for a pharmaceutical company, the kind of man who measured his worth in quarterly earnings reports and golf course dinners with executives. He was good at his job, I'll give him that. He was good at looking successful, at shaking the right hands, at wearing the right watch. Our neighbors thought he was a saint for keeping his mother out of a nursing home. They had no idea I was the one who hadn't had a full night's sleep in 4 years. They had no idea I hadn't seen a movie in a theater, hadn't gone out to dinner with a friend, hadn't bought myself a new winter coat because every spare dollar and every spare hour belonged to a woman who wasn't even my own mother. I didn't resent Margaret. I want to be clear about that. I loved her in the strange, quiet way you love someone you've nursed through their worst days. What I resented, what I didn't even let myself name as resentment for a long time, was Richard's absence. Not just physical absence, though there was plenty of that. Business trips that stretched longer than they needed to. Dinners he forgot to come home for. Something colder, something I couldn't put words to. A husband who stopped asking how I was doing because he already assumed the answer didn't matter. I used to lie awake next to him on the nights he was actually home and listen to him breathe, wondering when exactly we'd become 2 people sharing a mailing address instead of a marriage. I never asked him directly. I told myself it wasn't the right time, that Margaret needed stability, that I couldn't afford to blow up our home while she was still alive and needed both of us. Even if both of us had become mostly just me, looking back now, I think some small, quiet part of me already knew how this would end. You don't spend 4 years being someone's unpaid nurse and unpaid wife without a certain numbness setting in, a bracing for the moment the other shoe drops. I just didn't expect the shoe to drop the same week we buried his mother. I didn't expect him to wait until the flowers on her grave hadn't even wilted before he told me flatly that my usefulness had an expiration date. But that's exactly what happened, and that's where I have to take you back to the porch. The rain, the garbage bag in his hand instead of an umbrella, and the words that ended 20 years and 11 seconds. I stood there in the downpour, soaked through before I even reached the sidewalk. And I didn't cry. I want you to understand that. I didn't scream. I didn't beg him to reconsider. I just picked up my suitcase and walked because some part of me, some part that had been quietly gathering evidence for 4 years, already knew I wasn't losing a home that night. I was finally leaving one I'd never really had. My phone buzzed in my pocket as I reached the end of the driveway. A text from a number I didn't recognize. "Joanna, don't leave town. Margaret left something only for you." 4 weeks before Margaret died, she had one of those rare mornings where the fog lifted almost completely, and for a few hours she was entirely herself again. I remember it so clearly because those mornings had become so few and far between that I'd learned to treasure them the way you treasure the last warm days before winter. I was reading to her from an old hardcover of Anne of Green Gables, one of her favorites from childhood. When she reached over and put her hand on mine, her grip was thin but steady. "Joanna," she said, and there was nothing hazy in the way she said my name. No hesitations, no searching. "Promise me something." I set the book down and told her anything. She looked at me with eyes that seemed for that 1 hour entirely clear. "Promise me you'll never let Richard write the end of your story." I laughed it off gently, the way you do with someone whose mind drifts in and out, and told her not to worry about things like that. She squeezed my hand harder. "I mean it," she said. "I've watched him. He's my son, and I love him. But I've watched him treat you like hired help for 4 years, and I won't say it again. So listen now. Don't let him write the end of your story." Then, as quickly as the clarity had come, it began to slip, and within the hour, she was calling me by her sister's name again, asking if I'd fed the horses on their old farm in Kentucky, a place that hadn't existed in 70 years. I didn't understand, not then, how much weight was in that sentence. I filed it away as one of Margaret's lucid moments, touching but confusing, the kind of thing dementia patients say, "That sounds profound," because we want it to mean something. I had no idea she'd spent the 2 years prior sitting across a desk from a lawyer named Catherine Webb, rewriting the entire architecture of her estate in absolute secrecy. During those final weeks, Richard grew more distant than I'd ever known him to be. He was traveling constantly, or claiming to be. His phone, which used to sit face down on the kitchen counter, started staying in his jacket pocket, buzzing against his chest at dinner, at which point he'd excuse himself to the garage to take a work call. I noticed the name Vanessa appearing on his lock screen more than once. Vanessa Torres, a colleague from his office, someone I'd met exactly twice at company holiday parties. Someone who always smiled at me a beat too long, like she was calculating something. I noticed. I want to be honest with you. I noticed and I said nothing. I didn't check his phone. I didn't follow him to the garage and press my ear to the door. I told myself I was too tired to fight, too consumed with helping Margaret through her daily exercises, too depleted to have the kind of confrontation that would blow apart whatever thin structure was still holding our house together. Some women would call that weakness. I call it survival triage. You can only carry so much weight before you have to set something down, and I chose for those final weeks to set down my suspicion so I could carry Margaret instead. She passed on a Wednesday morning in early autumn with the window cracked open because she'd always loved the smell of falling leaves, and with my hand wrapped around hers exactly the way it had been for 4 years of mornings. She didn't struggle. Her breathing simply slowed, then stopped, like a tide going out for the last time. I sat with her for almost half an hour before I called anyone, because I wasn't ready to let the world back into the room yet. When Richard finally arrived an hour after I called him, still smelling faintly of a restaurant I didn't recognize, he stood at the foot of the bed and looked at his mother's body with an expression I can only describe as inconvenienced. No tears, no collapse, just a long exhale like a man relieved of a scheduling conflict. I told myself grief looks different on everyone. I told myself he was in shock. But something in me, some quiet observer who'd been watching our marriage from a slight distance for years, now filed that moment away too, next to the phone buzzing against his chest, next to the business trips that didn't quite add up, next to Margaret's hand gripping mine with a strength that shouldn't have still been in her. The funeral was small, dignified, exactly the kind of understated affair Margaret would have wanted. Richard gave a short, polished eulogy that sounded like it had been written by someone who'd read about grief rather than felt it. Neighbors offered casseroles and condolences. I stood at the graveside in a navy dress I hadn't worn since my own father's funeral, and I felt strangely calm, the calm of a woman who has already cried every tear she has in private, alone at 2 in the morning over the course of 4 long years. It was only after the last guest left, after Richard had gone back inside to pour himself a bourbon, that my phone rang. I almost didn't answer it. I didn't recognize the number and I was exhausted down to my bones. But something told me to pick up. Mrs. Cross. The woman on the other end said, her voice measured and professional. My name is Catherine Webb. I was your mother-in-law's attorney. She instructed me very specifically to wait exactly 1 week after her funeral before contacting you. There was a pause and I could hear papers shifting on the other end of the line. There are things you need to know, Joanna. Things Margaret made sure of long before she got sick. I'll call you again in 7 days. The line went dead before I could ask a single question. The 7 days after Margaret's funeral passed like a held breath. I didn't mention Catherine Webb's call to Richard. I told myself I was waiting for her to call back before I said anything. But if I'm honest, some instinct in me, the same one that had been quietly cataloging every small betrayal for months, told me to keep it to myself a little longer. On the 7th day, I finally worked up the courage to tell Richard I wanted to go back to teaching. I'd started thinking about it the moment Margaret passed, some small flicker of my old self stirring back to life for the first time in 4 years. I brought it up over dinner tentatively, the way you test ice before putting your full weight on it. I told him Oakwood Elementary had an opening for the spring semester, that my old principal Helen had actually reached out when she heard about Margaret, that I thought it might be good for both of us to have some normalcy again. Richard set down his fork very deliberately. He looked at me the way you'd look at someone who'd suggested something faintly ridiculous. Teaching? He repeated, like the word itself tasted bad. He said I'd been out of the classroom for 4 years, that education had moved on without me, that I'd be lucky if they let me supervise recess, let alone run a room full of 9-year-olds. He said it with a small, condescending laugh that I'd heard more times over the years than I wanted to admit, a laugh that always made me feel about 2 inches tall. I told him I wanted to try anyway. That's when his face changed, and I watched 20 years of carefully maintained politeness drain out of it all at once. You want to try, he said. Joanna, I only needed you to take care of my mother. He said it flatly, the way you'd state a fact about the weather. I sat there, fork frozen halfway to my mouth, waiting for him to soften it, to explain it away, to tell me he didn't mean it the way it sounded. He didn't. He kept going, his voice rising with something that had clearly been building for a long time. He told me he'd tolerated 4 years of a marriage that had stopped meaning anything to him because his mother needed a full-time caretaker, and he couldn't afford a professional one without touching his investments. He told me that was the only reason he hadn't already asked for a divorce. Now she's gone, he said. So are you? He reached into his pocket and pulled out the spare house key, the one I'd given him a copy of years ago in case he ever locked himself out, and set it on the table between us like a period at the end of a sentence. Then he stood, walked to the front door and opened it. Outside, the sky had gone the color of a bruise, and rain was already starting to needle down against the porch steps. I remember standing up very slowly. I remember my hands not shaking, which surprised me because everything else in me felt like it had been struck by lightning. I went upstairs, packed a single suitcase with the essentials. I didn't even take half of what was mine, and walked back down past him without a word. He didn't help me. He didn't apologize. He just watched, arms crossed, as I stepped out into the storm with my life reduced to 1 bag and no umbrella. Nobody stopped me on the walk to the bed and breakfast 3 blocks away, the one with the wraparound porch I'd driven past 100 times without ever really seeing it. Nobody offered a ride. I hadn't told a single friend or family member what had happened yet, because I genuinely didn't know how to say the words out loud. 20 years, and I was walking through a rainstorm with a suitcase like a woman, half my age, fleeing a bad first date. I checked into a room that smelled faintly of lavender and old wood, sat on the edge of a bed that wasn't mine, and finally let myself feel the full weight of what had just happened. I didn't cry, not right away. I just sat there, soaked to the bone, staring at a window I never opened, feeling something strange settle over me. Not devastation exactly, but a kind of grim clarity like fog finally burning off a landscape you'd been driving through blind. My phone rang once that night. Catherine Webb's name lit up the screen. I stared at it for a long moment, thumb hovering, and then let it go to voicemail. I wasn't ready. Whatever she had to tell me, it could wait one more night. I needed to just breathe first. Back at the house, Richard poured himself a bourbon and, according to what I'd learned much later, called Vanessa before he'd even finished his first glass. "It's done," he told her, his voice loose and satisfied. "I'm finally free." He told her he could see them building something real now, something without the weight of a sick old woman and a wife who'd stopped being useful to him. He told her the house was his, the future was his, and nothing was standing in his way anymore. He had no idea, sitting there with his drink and his certainty, exactly how wrong he was. At 8:30 that evening, freshly showered and feeling lighter than he had in years, Richard pulled his car into the driveway of the Victorian farmhouse he believed was entirely his. But as his headlights swept across the front of the house, he saw something that made him ease his foot off the brake. Two dark sedans were already parked at the curb waiting. For a moment Richard sat frozen behind the wheel, his mind scrambling through a list of possibilities. A break-in, a neighbor's emergency, some kind of mistake. He told himself it had nothing to do with him, that whatever this was would sort itself out, and he could go inside and finish his drink in peace. He was wrong about that, too. He stepped out of the car slowly, gravel crunching under his shoes, rain still falling in a steady drizzle that had softened from the earlier downpour. A woman in a dark suit stepped forward from beside the first sedan, polite but immovable, and asked him to wait a moment. Richard's confusion tightened into irritation, the particular irritation of a man used to being the one who gave instructions, not received them. "This is my house," he said. "Who exactly are you people?" That's when Catherine Webb stepped out of the second vehicle, a slim leather folder tucked under one arm, her expression calm in the specific way of someone who has done this exact thing many times before and feels no need to rush it. She introduced herself. She told him she'd been Margaret's attorney for the past several years, and that she was here to formally execute the terms of Margaret's estate. Richard's irritation flickered just briefly into something like unease, though he covered it quickly with a scoff. He told her he already knew the terms of his mother's estate. He'd seen the will years ago. The house was his, same as it had always been meant to be. Catherine opened the folder and, without any particular drama in her voice, explained that the will Richard was thinking of had been superseded 3 years earlier by a revocable living trust, one that Margaret had established quietly with full legal capacity, well before her diagnosis had progressed to the point where her competency could be questioned. Under the terms of that trust, the house had never belonged to Richard at all. It had remained solely in Margaret's name until her death, at which point ownership would transfer in its entirety to whoever had served as her full-time primary caregiver through the end of her life. Richard laughed, a short, disbelieving bark of a sound. He said that was absurd, that no court would uphold something like that his mother wouldn't have done this to her own son. Catherine, unmoved, turned a page in her folder and read the relevant clause aloud, her voice even and precise. The language was unambiguous. The caregiver was named specifically. Joanna Marie Cross. I want to tell you, I felt some surge of triumph hearing about this later, some vindicated satisfaction watching my husband's certainty crumble in his own driveway. But when Catherine told me the story afterward over coffee in her office, what I actually felt was something quieter and heavier. The realization that Margaret had spent her last lucid years quietly building me a lifeboat, stitching it together in secret, because she knew long before I let myself admit it, exactly what her son was capable of. Richard's voice rose in the driveway that night, according to the neighbor who later told me she'd watched the whole thing from her window with her hand over her mouth. He told Catherine this was insane, that he'd contest it, that no piece of paper was going to take his childhood home away from him. Catherine, still perfectly composed, informed him that contesting a properly executed trust prepared by independent legal counsel with documented medical evaluation confirming Margaret's competency at the time of signing would be an extremely uphill battle and an expensive one. She then handed him a formal notice. He had 48 hours to vacate the premises. I arrived at the house the next morning at Catherine's request, still wearing yesterday's clothes, because I hadn't packed for more than a single overnight. Richard was standing in the front hallway when I walked in, surrounded by half-filled boxes, his face a mixture of fury and something raw underneath it, something that almost looked like fear. He turned on me the moment he saw me. "You planned this," he said, his voice cracking with the effort of controlling it. "You and my mother behind my back for years. You knew this whole time." I stood in the doorway of the house I'd scrubbed and painted and grieved in. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, I didn't feel the urge to shrink, to apologize, to smooth things over the way I'd smoothed over every hard edge of our marriage for 2 decades. I looked at him steadily, rain still dripping off the hem of my coat onto the hardwood floor. Margaret had always asked me to polish on Saturdays. "No," I said. "Your mother did." He didn't have anything to say to that. He just stood there among his half-packed boxes in a house that had already stopped being his, staring at a wife he'd told to leave with nothing, only to discover that she was the one thing his mother had made, certain he couldn't take away. Moving back into the house didn't feel the way I expected it to. I thought there'd be some triumphant sense of reclaiming what was mine. But instead, for the first few weeks, every room felt haunted by a version of my life I was trying to leave behind. The kitchen still smelled faintly like Margaret's chamomile tea. The hallway still had the small scuff marks from her walker, worn into the hardwood over 4 years of slow, careful laps back and forth for exercise. I'd walk past her old room and still expect, for one disorienting second, to hear her calling my name. I gave myself 2 weeks to sit with all of it before I let myself think about anything else. Then I called Oakwood Elementary. My old principal, Helen, a warm, no-nonsense woman who'd sent flowers to Margaret's funeral, didn't hesitate. She said the 4th grade position was still open, that half the staff had asked about me over the years, that she'd be thrilled to have me back the moment I was ready. I cried on the phone with her, the good kind of crying, the kind that comes from a door opening instead of one closing. 3 weeks later, I stood in front of a classroom full of 9-year-olds again, chalk dust on my sleeve, and felt something in my chest unclench for the first time in years. It was through the school that I met Michael Brennan. His daughter Lily was in my class, a bright, thoughtful girl who reminded me of the kind of student I used to write future novelist jokes about in report card comments. Turns out her father was a carpenter who specialized in restoring historic homes, including the very Victorian farmhouse I now owned. Michael was a widower, his wife having passed from an autoimmune disease 5 years earlier. And there was something about the way he carried himself that I recognized instantly, a particular kind of tiredness that comes from holding a household together alone. He showed up to parent-teacher conferences with genuine questions, not performative ones. He remembered the names of the other kids in Lily's reading group. He thanked me sincerely for the small things, for staying late to help Lily with her fractions, for noticing when she seemed off after a hard week. Our friendships started slowly, the way real things tend to. He came by one Saturday to look at a section of the porch railing that had come loose in a storm, something he'd offered to do after overhearing me mention it at pickup. He didn't make it a big gesture, he just showed up with his tools, fixed the railing, and left before I could even properly thank him. A few weeks later, he restored the original stained glass in the front door that had been painted over since before Margaret got sick. When I caught a bad cold in early winter, he left a pot of soup on my doorstep with a note that just said, "Feel better." No reply needed. I remember standing in my kitchen with that note in my hand, feeling something I hadn't felt in years, not romance, not yet, just the strange, quiet relief of being looked after by someone who expected nothing in return. Richard, in the meantime, had moved into a small apartment across town, the kind of place with beige walls and a view of a parking garage. I heard about it secondhand through mutual acquaintances who couldn't resist passing along the details. He'd tried at first to maintain the same image he'd always cultivated, successful, unbothered, moving on just fine. But Vanessa, it turned out, had never been particularly interested in Richard himself. She'd been interested in the version of him that came with a paid-off Victorian house and a vice president's salary. The moment word got out that he'd lost the house, that his mother's estate had bypassed him entirely, Vanessa's interest evaporated with startling speed. She stopped returning his texts. She started arriving late to meetings he was in and leaving early. Within 2 months, she'd transferred to a different division of the company entirely, and Richard was left alone in his beige apartment with nothing to show for the version of freedom he'd been so eager to celebrate that rainy night with his bourbon. I heard through the same grapevine that he'd started drinking more, that he'd grown quieter at work, less of the sharp, confident salesman his colleagues used to describe. I felt something when I heard that, but it wasn't satisfaction, not exactly. It was more like the particular sadness you feel watching someone finally reckon, alone and too late, with a truth they'd spent years avoiding. Meanwhile, my life kept quietly rebuilding itself. I started sleeping through the night again. I started laughing at things without immediately feeling guilty for enjoying myself. Michael and I began having coffee after school pickups. Nothing formal, just two tired adults comparing notes on their strange, upended lives. He never pushed. He never made me feel like I owed him anything for his kindness, which after 20 years of a marriage built on obligation felt like its own kind of miracle. It was late on a Tuesday evening, almost 6 months after that rainy night on the porch, when my phone rang and Richard's name appeared on the screen for the first time since the driveway confrontation. I let it ring twice before I answered, mostly out of surprise. His voice when I picked up sounded smaller than I remembered it, stripped of its usual polish. "Joanna," he said, "can we talk?" I agreed to meet him, mostly out of curiosity, and partly because some old, worn-down part of me still felt like I owed 20 years the courtesy of a final conversation. We met at a small coffee shop halfway between our two lives, the kind of place with mismatched mugs and quiet jazz playing too softly to identify. Richard looked different, thinner, a little grayer at the temples, dressed less carefully than I'd ever seen him. He'd always been a man who pressed his own shirts before important conversations. That night, his collar was slightly wrinkled, and something about that small detail told me more than anything he was about to say. He started with an apology, the kind that comes out in a rush after months of rehearsing it alone in an empty apartment. He said he'd been under enormous pressure those last few years. Work, his mother's illness, money worries he'd never told me about. He said grief had made him cruel in ways he didn't recognize until it was too late to take back. He reached across the table at one point like he might take my hand, then seemed to think better of it and pulled back. I let him finish. I didn't interrupt. Didn't soften my expression to make it easier for him. Didn't offer him the reassurance I might have given freely 20 years ago. When he was done, I asked him one question, the only one that actually mattered to me anymore. "When exactly did you stop loving me?" He opened his mouth, then closed it again. He stared down at his coffee like the answer might be written in the steam rising off it. He tried a few times to start a sentence and abandoned each one halfway through. Watching him struggle, I understood something I hadn't fully let myself accept before. It wasn't that he'd stopped loving me at some identifiable point, some moment I could pin down and grieve properly. It was that he'd never really known how, not in the way that mattered, not in the daily, unglamorous, unrewarded way love actually requires. He'd loved the idea of a devoted wife the way he loved his job title, as something that reflected well on him, not as something that required him to show up for another person when it wasn't convenient. I didn't say any of that out loud. I didn't need to anymore. I just felt the last thread of obligation I'd been carrying without even realizing it quietly go slack. Michael arrived a few minutes later, right on schedule, because we'd planned to walk through the botanical garden that same evening, and he'd offered to swing by the coffee shop first, so I wouldn't have to sit alone in the parking lot afterward. He didn't come inside or make a scene. He simply waited by his truck in the lot, visible through the coffee shop's front window, patient in the particular way that had become so familiar to me over the past several months. Richard saw him. I watched something shift across his face. Not jealousy exactly. Something closer to a slow, sinking recognition. For the first time in his life, Richard understood what it felt like to be the one standing outside, waiting for someone who had already moved on without him. He asked me quietly now, almost pleading, if there was any chance we could try again. Start over. He said he'd changed, that losing everything had taught him things he should have learned decades ago. I believed in that moment that he might even mean it. But meaning something and having earned the right to ask for it are two very different things, and I'd spent enough of my life confusing the two. I already spent 20 years proving my love, I told him, gathering my coat from the back of the chair. I'm not spending another 20 proving my value. I said it without anger, without theater, the way you state something you've simply come to know as fact. He didn't argue. I think some part of him had expected exactly that answer, even if he'd hoped for a different one. I left him there in the booth, staring at his cooling coffee, and walked out to where Michael was waiting. He didn't ask what had happened. He just opened the truck door for me the way he always did, and let the silence between us be comfortable instead of demanding an explanation. 3 days later, my phone rang again, but this time it was Catherine Webb, not Richard. Her voice had a gentler quality than I'd heard from her before, less businesslike. She told me there was one more piece of Margaret's affairs that needed to be settled. A sealed letter Margaret had left